Welcome to Seeking Connection Literature from Germany and Switzerland. It's a Bay Area book festival. I do have to ask, please, if you can silence your phones and pages, if you just put it on silent or vibrant. My name is Sabine Kieselbach. I'm literary correspondent of Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster, and I've been honored to be invited to moderate this panel. With me are four wonderful German writers, German and from Switzerland, and Takis Würger, the only man here at the panel, a highly acclaimed reporter at the news magazine Der Spiegel. His debut novel, The Club, was just published in English. It was a bestseller in Germany and is right now made into a movie. Here is Dorothee Elmiger from Switzerland, the second on the left.
No, minorities first.
Yeah. Minorities first. She is widely regarded as one of the most important contemporary Swiss writers, and her most recent book, Shift Sleepers, was published in English 2 months ago. Katja Petrowskaja on my left is born in Ukraine, living in Berlin for almost 20 years. Her debut, Maybe Esther, was translated into more than 20 languages and published in the US in 2018. And Nora Krug, illustrator and writer living for many years in New York. Her graphic memoir, Belonging, just came out in fall and was written first in English and translated into many languages. Anyways, this panel will mostly be a discussion or conversation. We'll have time for questions at the end. And after this panel, the books will be available. I can highly recommend all of the books of these writers. What I'm going to do is ask each of the writers to read a little section of their books, talk a bit about the context. Well, and then hopefully we will have a conversation about today's topic of the session, Seeking Connection. Where is my place in the world? Where do I belong? Takis, I marked that short section, I gave you the book, of your novel right at the beginning. I'm wondering if you're willing to read that, okay?
Yeah. Hello, thank you for coming. Thank you very much for the intro. Thank you to the festival for letting me be here, letting us be here. I'm actually not going to read the entire thing you told me because a couple of words are in there that I don't know how to pronounce. So, so I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs. Do I say anything about the context?
Yeah, the first paragraph is at the beginning of the book. The protagonist is Hans.
Right.
And you describe his character in this section.
Yeah. On my 8th birthday, mother asked the other parents to bring their children round to our house. I sat quietly in front of the marbled cake. I was excited and wondered whether the children would become my friends. In the afternoon, we played hide and seek. I ran into the forest and climbed a chestnut tree. They won't find me here, I thought happily. I stayed up the tree all day. I only came home in the evening. I was proud that no one had found me and asked my parents where the other children were. Mother told me my hiding place had been too good and took me in her arms. All my life, my hiding place was too good. Nobody ever reacted like that in Germany.
When this poor boy, Hans, finishes high school, his aunt asks him to come to Cambridge as a student and help solving a criminal case, just that he doesn't know what's up. But he accepts the order and even changes his name at her request, and he manages to become a member of the Pit Club, the inner circle of the university. The next section I want you to read is at the end of the book, same voice, different role. Would you read it?
Yeah, no.
No?
No, because it takes away too much of the story. I'm sorry, but I'm going to read something else. But it's also really.
Hey, I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it's a thriller, and so if you, it's the end of the book. If I read that to you now, then I lost pretty much.
That's why I paid $10.
I'm going to whisper you how it's going to end later. So I'm actually going to read a moment after the only sex scene in the book. I'm going to leave that out. I thought, so Hans goes to Cambridge, falls in love with this upper class girl, and but feels super insecure about everything, and then and to his great surprise, she goes on a trip to Somerset in South England, and at night she walks into his room, and things go from there. And afterwards, he's thinking about it. I thought about how she moved so confidently in a world that was foreign to me. When she'd kiss the antiques dealer on the cheek, when she tied my bow tie, when she'd hit me on the back of the head, when she'd come to me tonight on bare feet. But it wasn't this strength that I was attracted to. I could sense her pain. I didn't know where it came from, but it was there, and it attracted me. I think we found each other in our weakness. What are you thinking? She asked. Nothing, I said. I was thinking that her hair curled at the nape of her neck like candy floss. Nonsense, she said. Your hair's like candy floss, I said. She was sure to laugh at me now. That sounds pretty, she said. From then on, I tried to breathe with her in sync.
And why did you choose this section?
Because I believe in the end the book is a love story, and I think that they connect in a way that still leaves them disconnected, and at the same time they like each other so much that they find each other, and I think that's what love is in the end, and I like it. I mean, I like not that I like my writing, but I like the idea that you don't really understand somebody, but you still say, why don't we walk together a little?
Okay, thank you. Dorothee Elmiger, your book, Shift Sleepers, is a chorus of voices, workers, smugglers, refugees, asylum seekers, writers, and ghosts. These voices, where do they belong to? Where do they come from?
That's a good question, and while writing the book, I decided to not answer this question because I thought a lot about borders and border crossing, and often when you meet somebody, the first question is where you're from, where do you live? So for these voices that are in some kind of conversation, I didn't want to ask this question. So I know it's an irritation for many readers that they have to constantly keep asking themselves, where are they, what space are they in? But I thought that was the best way to write the text.
Okay. These characters tell of their perceptions. One of the voices is from a woman named A.L. Erika, and she's talking about another protagonist, a female writer. I marked a section in the book. Could you please read this part?
Yes. In a letter, the writer wrote that she had abandoned work on her text about borders after the night walk through the forest. She was a writer, wrote the writer, and the circumstance that the unfortunate situation on the border constituted her authorial capital was untenable. It had been extremely presumptuous of her even to undertake a trip to these places, said the writer, and she had laid her pen aside. Was the act of not writing also an authorial act in that moment, she asked on the bottom margin of the page. She considered the laying aside of the pen very important, the movement of the hand demonstratively removing itself from the paper, the most important aspect of it perhaps being that no one had witnessed this act.
What scruples does the writer have? Are these your scruples, Dorothee?
They are also my scruples, yes. I think when I was writing the text, I was traveling a lot myself. I was traveling with the first book, my first novel, and I have this really red Swiss passport, and traveling was very easy for myself. And while I was writing the book, there's this quote by an American writer, actually, who said, some people cross the border and their bodies remain unchanged, or they do not cross the border, and other people cross the border and nothing happens. Yeah, did I say it? Did I say it?
It's the same.
Some bodies remain unchanged, and some are being changed when they cross the border. And of course, not. I never make this experience myself. When I cross the border, usually nothing happens. And so I think I do have to ask myself the question if I can, and how, in what way can I write about these questions.
Thank you. Katja Petrowskaja, Maybe Esther, this is the novel published in 2018, are stories, logs, fragments of your search for the roots of your family, your very self. You come from a Ukrainian Jewish family, and your book is also a story about the 20th century, about the Soviet Union, about the war, about the Holocaust. Could you please read this section of your book? It starts here and it ends here.
Oh my God. Actually, thank you. First, I want to thank all organizers of this event, because actually it's very attractive to represent Germany. And I find our group so typical, or German language, yeah. Actually, I still have a Ukrainian pass, and I can tell my stories, how to cross the borders and where your soul is, because to travel to the States, you still have to answer the question: did you took part in genocide? Wow. And I think it's really incredible. Okay, I wanted to ask them from what side, and
here it's
yeah. I don't see anything. So I wrote a book in German. I'm a Russian speaker, and I started to learn German very late, which is very noticeable. I don't see anything.
Here it starts.
Are there any letters?
When leader.
When Lida, my mother's older sister, passed away, I came to understand the meaning of the word history. My longing was fully developed. I was ready to submit myself to the windmills of memory, and then she died. I was standing there with bated breath, ready to ask, rooted to the sport, and if this had been a comic book, my speech bubble would have been empty. History begins when there are no more people to ask, only sources. I had no one left to question, no one who could still recall these times. All I had were fragments of memory, notes of dubious value, and documents in distant archives. Instead of asking questions at the right time, I had choked on the word history. Had Lida's death brought me to adulthood, I was at the mercy of history. Until what? Okay. Okay. The only thing I have from Aunt Lida is a recipe, or recipe, but it's
recipe for a refreshing.
Recipe for a refreshing drink known as kvass. The recipe recently jumped out at me from a pile of unpaid bills, as though I owed something to Lida. After the war, Aunt Lydia Lida, or Lida as we called her, was known as the classical beauty of the Kiev Pedagogical Institute, Lida from the Department of Defectology, as arthropedagogy is still called back home. Yet, when I knew Lida, the same Lida who peered down at us serenely and unflappably from photographs, she was a shuffling creature in an apron who had said nothing for years, just served. One course after another, then into the kitchen and back again, on plates with a gilded rim. Eat. She had been the last one in the family to teach the deaf-mute children. She knew the secret. She knew patience. She cooked in silence, and now she was gone.
History begins when there are no more people to ask. Was this the realization the moment when you decided to write this book?
I mean, it's one of the 1,001 reasons, yeah.
Can you?
Because, yeah, no. Are you ready for the 1,001 nights? Then maybe. Actually, I think it's for many people like that. First, you often start to write when you are in the other environment. Maybe it's also the case of Nora. Because I knew all these stories, more or less, but only in Germany I really realized that they are not convertible. So it's like a photography which develops in the exit or whatever, and maybe it's also the point when maybe adultery really, because there are many really catastrophic stories in my books, and I was absolutely not ready to confront them before. Maybe it's like studying Kabbalah, you have to reach a certain age, and. It's maybe also often with writing that writing is emerging from out of the conflict of richness of stories, or sort of like too much to tell, and at the same time of the very, very precise feeling of deficit. So like you're lacking something, you can't understand something, and for me it was this kind of 20th century history. I mean, who can understand all that? So maybe therefore it has a touch of fairy tale, because in the beginning of each fairy tale something is lacking. So and the whole movement of telling is an attempt to repair the world. So maybe like that.
Thank you. Nora Krug, Katja Petrowskaja has called her book a family book.
I didn't.
I've read that in an interview. Maybe you were quoted wrong. Okay. Belonging is also, or is, a family history. It's your attempt to confront the hidden truths of your family's past in Nazi Germany about guilt and responsibility. You're an illustrator. Your book is a graphic memoir. So would you show us some examples of your book and words and what this book is about?
Yes, and before I read, I also wanted to contextualize. So the book is a fully illustrated visual memoir, I call it, that describes my process of trying to find out who my family members were and what their potential involvement under the Nazi regime was. But it's equally a search for German cultural identity, which I think most Germans of my generation are still struggling with, because it's still so deeply tied to what happened under the Nazi regime. So it's both a search for my family and for German cultural identity, which is why I made some of the visual choices and conceptual choices that I'm making in the reading. From the Notebook of a Homesick Emigre, Things German, number 1, Hansaplast. Hansaplast is a brand of bandage developed in 1922. My mother applied it to my bleeding knee after a roller skating accident when I was 6 years old. Next to my mother, Hansaplast was the safest thing in the world. No matter if your skin is thick or thin, smooth or wrinkly, dry or moist, Hansaplast is so reliable that it won't come off until your wound has fully healed. It is the most tenacious bandage on the planet, and it hurts when you tear it off to look at your scar.
That's the beginning of the book.
Yeah. It was one of my very first encounters in New York City. I was standing on the rooftop of my friend's apartment building, the only person I knew so far in the city. I had just moved here from Berlin to study. I didn't know anyone. No one knew me. Everything was possible. An elderly woman sitting in a lounge chair had overheard our conversation. "Where are you from?" she asked me. "I'm from Germany." That's what I thought. "Have you ever been to Germany?" I asked. "Yes, a long, long time ago." She avoided eye contact. And then I understood. She went on to tell me about how she had survived the concentration camp because one of the female guards had rescued her from the gas chamber 16 times at the last moment. The guard, who had exhibited merciless violence toward everyone else in the camp, regularly knocking prisoners' heads together for punishment, had the elderly woman suspected a secret crush on her. Female prison guards. 16 times on the edge of the gas chamber. 16 times escaping immediate death by a hair's breadth, 16 times seeing others walk to their deaths while you must live. A familiar heat began to form in the pit of my stomach. How do you react as a German, standing across from a human being who reveals this memory to you? I remained silent. That was a long time ago, she finally said. I'm sure things have changed. You seem like someone who was raised by loving parents. I nodded. Chapter 1, Early Dawning. Our backyard in Karlsruhe, in the south of Germany, faced a US military air base where planes regularly took off and landed. I heard them hissing and roaring above our house like dangerous animals that had unbelievably decided to spare our lives. Part of me understood that something had once gone horribly wrong. Are Jews evil? I asked my mother one day after coming home from elementary school. It was around the time that I had made it a habit to change into the panther costume she had sewn me for carnival. Of course they aren't. Who told you that? She stopped stirring and vigorously rubbed her hands dry on her apron. My religion teacher said it was the Jews who killed Jesus. Not knowing any Jews, I assumed that they didn't exist outside of the Bible. They seemed distant, like a long-extinct species. Experiencing my mother's anger, I concluded that day that Jews, all Jews, were good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nora, you lived for almost 20 years abroad and are now living in Brooklyn, working as a professor in New York City. In interviews, you have declared you would never have written this book if you still lived in Germany. Why?
I think because of what Katja said earlier, is that sometimes you need the distance, geographical distance, and in my case also the distance to the German language, because I wrote it first in English, to really see the past. And so I think my book is very much about looking from a distance, which is also conveyed in the cover image, which again is a reference to Caspar David Friedrich's book, painting Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is also about looking home, or looking inwardly really, because the landscape in a way becomes a symbol for introspection. And so to me, the book was an inner portrait rather than an outer one of, trying to figure out what German identity means. Of course, I didn't in the course of.
But we see this person from the back.
Yes, that's something I write about in the book, because a part of the book was also trying to understand the collective and the personal nature of memory and the memory of war, and trying to, if not come to terms with it, understand it or get a clearer perspective on it. And part of the attempt of doing that on my end was visiting German flea markets over the course of several years, and looking for evidence, basically, personal objects and letters and photographs by people who lived under the Nazi regime, in order to try to understand, to get a more visceral sense of that experience, because those artifacts and objects my grandparents did not leave me with. So it almost was a stand-in for my own family's experience. So it was trying to get a sense of the collective versus the personal. And a lot of photographs I found while I was looking were actually of people from behind looking at landscapes, which I really found interesting, because from the turn of the century up to really probably before the iPhone was invented, people in Germany have photographed themselves from behind looking at landscapes. And I don't know if the Caspar David Friedrich painting somehow resonates for them subconsciously, but it seems to be a specifically German urge to do, and I don't really know what it is.
What did you find out about your family?
I mean, I knew from the beginning that they weren't major war criminals, because in Germany, obviously, the names of those who, the biggest perpetrators are in the public eye, so I would have already known if they had been part of that group. So I knew that I was looking more for evidence for things, that the classic group of Germans who were the Mitläufer, meaning the followers who followed along. And as I was doing some research, I realized that it's exactly that group that I was interested in, because that group's innocence and guilt is impossible to measure, and it really informs the way we think about how dictatorial regimes come to be, because it is that big mass that I think that we need to look at more closely. I think the popular media really tend to focus more on the perpetrators and the heroes, and I think we need to try to understand the gray mass, also in terms of why these things happen today, again, in various countries. And so what I found out was that my maternal grandfather chose to be a member of the Nazi party, even though only 15% of all Germans were members of the party, and I say only in quotation marks, because it wasn't that people didn't want to join, it was more that at some point the Nazis put a stop on admissions, so it wasn't so easy to join. And so he, I was trying to find out what the reasons were that made him join, and I found a US military file at one of the archives in my hometown that revealed basically his motivations for why he made this decision.
Germans are praised worldwide for their dealing with the past. We say Vergangenheitsbewältigung. You have a more critical point of view. Why? You don't praise it. Well, to me, it describes a process and not a solution, because that's why I don't, one of my fears was that people might misunderstand my book as an attempt of trying to overcome the feeling of guilt or understanding what being German means. But I think that there are no answers to these things. So writing and drawing the book wasn't an attempt of feeling less guilty. And I think Vergangenheitsbewältigung is a process. But Katja talks a lot about terminology and how words inform culture and vice versa. And I think, there are problematic words in the German language that refer to our attempt of dealing with our troubled past. And, for instance, Wiedergutmachung, I think, is a terrible, it's a terrible term. So I think, we need to look at these terms as processes and not as solutions. I think they're just much more complicated.
And solutions, yeah.
Can you speak into the mic? I told already that you live in abroad, far away from Germany for many years now. What do you feel connected to today? In Germany? Do you feel German, American? Did your book, the work for your book, change something?
Yeah, I think the book allowed me to return to Germany. Also literally, but also emotionally in a different way. And I've noticed that while I started working on the book, I suddenly became really interested in German artifacts that I would have never bought before. Like I have a cuckoo clock, for instance, now. And found that at a second-hand store in New England, and probably an American soldier had brought it from the Black Forest back to America in the 50s. And I like that political history of it as an object. But I would have never thought of buying something or displaying it in my home before. But I think working on the book allowed me to do that, because I feel like I really, for the first time in my life, faced my country's history in a different way, in an individual way, because I think the way I faced it previously was in school, and it was always on a collective level and on an institutional level. And we learned so much about the war and the Holocaust, but it was always a little bit remote. And at least in my experience, we weren't provided with the tools that would have allowed us to ask more personal questions about our families and about our hometowns. And so my book was an attempt of doing that, and it just let me look back with a clearer vision, which also, in a way, I sometimes criticize Germans for not being able to love their country and to publicly demonstrate that love, because I think that's problematic, because we can't leave that to the right wing, to the extreme right wing Germans that have emerged over the last years. It needs to be also those who want to look back continuously. But to me, I myself have a hard time with it. But to me, the book is almost like a commitment to my country. So it allowed me to commit more to my heritage.
To belong to your country, like the title.
I don't even know I would. Belonging is also, again, such a strong term.
In Germany, it's the title is Heimat, and in Great Britain too, but in America, the title is Belonging.
It's a complete different meaning. It's a complete different meaning.
But you can't have a belonging department like we do.
Katja Petrowskaja, you've started to learn German in your late 20s. 17 years later, you've written and published your book in German, and you've even won one of the most important German language book awards, the Bachmann Prize. And what do you say?
Culpa. Mehr culpa.
Accepted. What do you say? Is your book fiction or non-fiction?
I think it's not important. I'm sorry, I didn't want to. It wasn't. Actually, it's really a mistake. It's not a family story because it's a false pragmatic of reading because it's only in the States. My book got this subtitle, maybe because the publishing house wanted to sell my book to 3 million of American Jews. It didn't work. Actually, in German, and I really feel very connected to Nora, and I'm actually very, very moved, and it's hard for me to talk because I grew up with this massive Soviet myth of the Second World War, and actually with this feeling that it's a complete miracle that we survived. And actually this we was not Jewish, it was Soviet. It was completely not Jewish. And actually Soviet truth about the Second World War was really filled with many lies. For example, we've never talked about war prisoners, we've never talked about Holocaust. It's really hard to imagine. I grew up in Kiev. You have here in Jewish Museum just incredible amount of Jewish documents from my native city. We didn't know anything, just there was no Jewish history, there was no Jews, there were no Jews, and actually 3 people of from my family killed in the ravine of Babi Yar, and I knew about that, but I really felt it is very hard to explain what was that. But all attitude to Germany was very, very strangely mixed. So there were like few different concepts. First is this Second World War, and another one, and really not connected, this incredible language, Heinrich Heine, music. I sang in the choir, and actually, I wrote this book, and then many people asked me about my Jewishness, synagogues, and all that. I spent 10 years singing Bach. So what is my place? What is my childhood? What was my identity? We are always talking about identity, and actually to write in German, it was very, very interesting experience. You're like more yourself writing in another language, but at the same time you're another person. It's like that in this way, it's a real fiction because it's what literature gives you. Doesn't matter, is it? So for me, fictional was the language. So actually, the only fictional element in my book is German language. So actually, this person who is telling this story really cannot tell the story in German. So German is this fictional element, and German is a sort of reconciliation, and German is this fictionalizing, this possibility of whatever it is, and
was
it's exactly what literature...
Was it clear from the beginning?
No, because I was actually years I was collecting. I don't know why I do this with this glass. I was talking to my friends, my family, people, and it was Russian, so I was collecting stories in Russian language, and it was like a certain moment when I was standing. So there were really moments when I understood it's German which is coming out of me, and I was really very surprised. And actually, it's a very strange German because I studied literature, I wrote PhD, I used to deal with beautiful poetry. So it was a sort of Russian rhythm of Silver Age poetry, which I wanted to fill with German words in a way. So it's a very, very strange. I created this kind of innocent German language for me, and maybe it was actually. It's very interesting to live in Germany nowadays, and I'm not the first one who would say that Berlin, after all what happened in the 20th century, is the most peaceful, tolerant, and accepting city in Europe. And it means something, you know, and actually, therefore, for me, it's easier to represent Germany than to represent Russia or Kiev. It's easier in a way, but it's difficult at the same time. So there's so many things to say. So, and actually, the whole book, it's like a personal ritual, how to restore something for yourself. Maybe it's even an attempt of like oratorium or Passionen, I don't know. In this language I didn't know in my childhood, but I was singing in.
Did it change? So when did you learn that you're Jewish, that you're a family of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust victims, and what did it mean to you?
I mean, from early childhood, but I think that actually it's one doesn't need to be Jewish to understand that there is different kinds of knowing, also family stories. So you know something, but you don't really feel, and then you're like 30 years old or 40, and you sound just like suddenly like really struck by this. I knew that, for example, one guy from my family in 30s was trying to kill German ambassador in Moscow in the year 32, and his name was Judas Stern. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I knew the story, but I didn't realize what kind of material is it and what kind of craziness. So really, one guy from my family was exactly on the edge of this topic. What is Jewish communism and what is Nazi National Socialism? So with this name, so it's like invented. It's like so. It's also. I mean, life and historical life is sometimes. So really richer than literature. You are dealing with historical material and you think it couldn't have been possible, but it was not a question, I know.
It's okay.
I think that there are so many anecdotes about Jews and Jewish life and whatever, and there are many more types to be Jewish than Jews. So, I mean, whatever.
Okay. Dorothee Elmiger, first of all, your book's title is Shift Sleepers. What are shift sleepers?
In German, it's actually called Schlafgänger, which is very close to Schlafwandler, sleepwalkers. Yes, but it's not. It has a different meaning. The word was used, and it's not very known anymore in the German-speaking countries. It was used to describe those people who moved to the cities in the 19th century, when the cities were growing very quickly, and there was not enough living space for everybody. So many people not only shared apartments, but they shared beds. So they would sleep in shifts. There's also the word Kostgänger, which talks about a similar phenomenon when it comes to eating. So we would go places to eat and share the kitchen. And Schlafgänger, I don't know, I think this was the closest translation of the word that they
But
came
shift
up
sleepers is okay, I mean.
It is okay, yes. And it's also, I think, the German word, it's an old terminology that is not used anymore, but the phenomenon still exists in many places. I've been traveling a bit with this book, and I've visited many places where then people told me, oh, we have this here, like, places where people work in shifts, where they do not live with their families, but they're far out working in minories and places like that.
But why did you call your book Shift Sleepers or Schlafgänger?
Well, I think in the process of writing the book, on the one hand, I thought a lot about sleeping, the phenomenon of sleep. you know, we all sleep. It's like the most basic thing that despite all that has changed, we still need sleep. We haven't found a way to make that need go away. And it's also a very, what's the word, sensitive or sensible? It's a very precious thing that is easily disturbed. And in Switzerland, people who have come to the country as asylum seekers, they have often been placed to live in military bunkers and shipping containers with beds. So, you know, when you think about migration, people moving, there are these very ordinary things that not many people spend a lot of time thinking about, but it's such an essential thing, sleep, that I did a lot of research about it. What does it mean? You know, also, for example, if you can't sleep in your own room for years, but you share your room with strangers. And then I also thought a lot about a poem by Walt Whitman, The Sleepers, where he walks around and he comes by all these sleepers, and I mean, they're all asleep, but you can tell the circumstances of their lives or their professions or, you know, their economical position in society by the way they're dressed or the way they're sleeping. So sleep occurred again and again when I was working on the book. There's also the Grenzgänger, which is also a similar word that means crossing the border. So it's also this a small meditation on these words.
This book is about, it's not only, but it's about refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, as I mentioned already. But you did not want to be the voice of the refugees, yet your book has become a book about migration across borders. Would you agree to describe this book like this?
Well, I think what I wanted to try was to think about how a society deals with the questions that arise when people arrive. Basically, I was trying to think about the question, how do we want to live together? I think that's the basic question. And I knew that I didn't want to, and I couldn't tell the stories of people who had to flee. I didn't want to try that, and I hope I didn't, you know, cross that boundary. But I think it is important. For example, if you take sleep, you know, I think also for myself, if I think of myself as a political subject, it also has an impact on me if in the country I live in, people are treated so differently, as if they're in the same space, but then again, they're not, different rules apply to them. So I really try to think about these things on that level. Also, then thinking about migration as a normal state, in the sense of that it has always happened. You know, in politics, it's always being talked about as something very extraordinary or new, but humans have always been moving, forced to move or wanted to move. And I also tell the story of a Swiss man who migrated to the US, who wanted to found a socialist utopian community. So also,
did you find it?
Well, it's still the remains. It was on where Dallas is now. So today there's the Reunion Tower. It's a large tower, and that's where they originally founded this community. I think the circumstances were not so lucky.
Not. not really successful. Your novel, even though your book was published in German before the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, today it's read as a response on that crisis. Do you see yourself as a political writer?
I think that writing is always political, because when you write, you have to choose every word, and you have to choose this word and not that one, and you have to have good reasons for doing that. And these decisions, I think, cannot be looked at out of a context of also political being and thinking. So, I think when I was working on this book, of course, everything was already happening. What is going on in the Mediterranean, for example, is not. It has come into focus a lot more. But I started writing 2010, and then I felt like this had been going on for too long. And I think, for me, what makes me write are always these things that upset me or trouble me or make me think. So.
In an interview about your first novel, you said that many newer books negotiate family stories, and the compelling relationships are the family ones, of which you think one has to get rid of it. Why? Because if that's true, Nora and Katja could never have written their stories.
Yes, so I don't know what that interview was. I think what I was probably talking about was that I felt like many people in my generation were really retreating into the very personal, telling personal love stories and family stories in a way that they didn't want to, in the years after the war, there was also a lot of formal experiment in writing things that I'm really interested in. And so I think what I witnessed was, and of course, I mean, it's a really unfair question, because I would never say this to Katja. What I mean is really this kind of, if I would write about my own life, which is kind of uneventful, it would be a boring book. And I think that many people wanted still to write about their own lives without doing a lot of research and without really working with language. I think that's probably what I was talking about.
Takis,
that's what I did, pretty much. So I thought I'd just remain silent, because all the other things you said were so meaningful. But now I thought maybe, that was me writing about my own life, and it was a love story. And
do you see yourself also as a political writer?
Sorry.
I completely agree with what you just said. I think it doesn't have anything to do with what you regard yourself as. I think the question is answered by the fact that you write. So, I think you write about your values and your positions to the world, and that automatically is political. So no, I wouldn't call myself a political writer, or that wasn't a goal when I started writing. But I believe you don't have a choice if you write about. So I write about elite snobbery, sexual violence in this book, and I think that automatically is political.
Your novel, The Club, is about a student in Cambridge, a member of the Pitt Club. You were a student in Cambridge too. How much do your own experiences and thoughts flow into your text?
A lot. I was fascinated and shocked at the same time about what I experienced there as a student, and that's why I wrote this book. So it has a lot to do, and I mean, to give you an idea, the book's about a German going to Cambridge, becoming part of the university boxing team, and then by coincidence pretty much also suddenly is part of all these British upper class institutions, and that's exactly what happened to me. And since I'm a reporter and I'm used to writing about all the extreme things I witness, I couldn't do that in this case because it wasn't cut out for journalism. But writing about it was still a way of dealing with it and processing my experiences.
You couldn't write a report about it, or what?
I mean, no, not really. I mean, it would have been unfair. I mean, usually, if you work as a reporter, you go somewhere and say, "Look, I'm the reporter. I'm here to write about this." If you go to Cambridge, usually you go there as a student. That's what I did.
But you wrote a report on your experiences in Cambridge in Der Spiegel, in the news magazine you're working for.
Yeah.
And you wrote that you saw that you now belong to the chosen ones when you were accepted in Cambridge.
Did I write?
Yeah, but you wrote that it's nonsense.
I wrote, yeah, the next sentence was that it's nonsense, yeah.
How could you ever believe that you were part of the elite?
I mean, it taps straight into the narrative that these institutions tell us. I mean, I said the same thing yesterday, go 300 meters north, or what is it, south, or that way. And that's what they tell you. That's what it's all about. I mean, that's why it costs so much money. And that's why so many people apply. When on my first day in Cambridge, I went to St. John's College. They said, you walk in very big footsteps. This college has educated 32 heads of states, 12 Nobel Prize winners, and 3 saints. And then you sit there and you think, all right. And it's very difficult to be surrounded by that and by an institution that is I mean, look, the University of Cambridge is I don't know, 8 times older than Germany. It's very difficult not to be impressed, and I was also almost disgusted by it, that you fall into this trap so much. But I mean, I think a lot of this, one of the reasons why people buy this book is because they feel exactly the same. They think, well, I really want to know what's going on in all these secret societies. And that's what I wanted to know, and that's why I became part of them.
But you also said the principle of elite is who is in it benefits that others are outside, and that this is unfair, but it's maybe we have to accept it.
I think we have to accept that this is happening. I think it's very hypocritical to criticize elites and then be elites at the same time. I mean, somebody told me. So I walked around here. Somebody told me that it's very difficult to get a house that's cheaper than $1 million. I mean, so I mean that's elitism, right?
What size for $1 million?
And it doesn't matter how many flowers you plant in your front yard or how many resist signs you put up. That's the hardcore elite. And even if you drive an electronic car, which costs $50,000, then that's exactly what it's all about. And you send your kids to Berkeley, and I believe parts of it are great. I mean, I was lucky enough before I dropped out to get a good education, one great aspect about going to Cambridge is you just get to know a lot of clever people. It's fantastic, and at the same time, it's also very easy to forget that that many people will never be part of this, don't have the chance, don't even think about applying because they come from, and a friend of mine who also dropped out, a friend of mine I boxed with, came from Nigeria. And so in Cambridge we have all these really interesting dinners with all the certain clubs, and that was a boxing club dinner. And they put you have a name sign like this, and it says your school on it. And Theo said, the moment they look on my sign, they see my school, they know I'm from South London, and I'm poor. Of course that's wrong. But it's also how it is. And at the same time, most of the parents still send their kids there. They say, yeah, it's wrong, but you know, it's the best school in the world.
Maybe it's the same here in Berkeley. Yeah. Now I have a question to all of you. Can you talk about when you have felt that your story is a story that you need to tell? And how did you come to think, I need to tell this story and I need to share the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was really not a particular event, but an accumulation of different experiences that really started in my youth. You know, when I went to high school and middle school and I traveled abroad and I was confronted with negative stereotypes towards Germans. And then when I moved here to study, it became more present, and the realization in me developed that I'm not a representative only of myself, but also of my country, and therefore its history, and that a certain responsibility comes with that. And so over the years, this urge grew to talk about the German experience of the war, which I think is still quite unfamiliar to a lot of people outside of Germany. And I also thought it was important to talk about that perspective, again, because I think we need to understand how dictatorial regimes come to be, and we only understand that if we look at different perspectives, including the ones that are unfamiliar or uncomfortable to us. And one of the key moments, though, was the one I described in the book that I read about, where I met this older woman on the rooftop of a building in New York City, because even though I had already heard Holocaust survivors speak in high school, there was something about the directness and unexpectedness of my encounter with this woman, and also the way she talked about her experience, which was not at all reproachful. It was just, she told me the facts of her life, and I really appreciated that she did. And in that moment, something that I should have understood much earlier, I think understood in that encounter, which was that that history is always part of the present, and that we are made of history, and that we can't and shouldn't separate ourselves from it. And I think there's a sense, especially today in many countries, including the USA, but also Germany, that history can be left behind, or that it's something that we should minimize, and I think that's just wrong, because I feel like you can't understand or even fully appreciate your country unless you look at every moment in its history, even the bad ones. I think that's just a responsibility we all have, no matter where we're from. And so I think this encounter with that woman, who I then met again actually recently for the first time ever since I had this encounter with her, because I was able to find her when my book went into print, through a number of different detective activities. And a friend of mine actually, who's very involved in the German and Austrian Jewish emigre scene in New York, he found out where she lives and went there over lunch, over his lunch break, because it was around the corner from his office, and called her on the security guard's phone and told her about me. I mean, I was it was all a bit too fast for me, but then she became really curious about who I am and why why I was trying to find her. And so I called her, and while I spoke to her after 16 years of not even knowing who that woman was. I mean, I only spoke to her for 5 minutes on the rooftop of that apartment building. I suddenly broke out into tears on the phone, and this had never happened to me with a stranger before. And it was in that moment that I realized that encounter had meant so much to me because of the immediacy of history that emerged through her physically. And that's probably why I instinctively put this scene at the very beginning of my book.
Dorothee, was there an initial moment when you realized you want to write this story, this novel, this chorus?
Yeah, I think that I started writing at a moment when I felt the public debate on migration, also in the media, became more and more tense in a way, and very it started to lose complexity in a way that made it really hard to have different kinds of discussions. And I think in all my writing, but this book especially, I felt like, writing a letter to friends, not people, strangers that I wanted to convince of something that they were completely opposed to, but maybe, a letter to friends to keep a discussion going, or give it more room, and also to receive answers. So I think that was the impulse for starting the work on the book.
We're running out of time, so I would like to ask you, do you have any questions for our writers, for our panel?
I have a question. Is this working?
Not really.
Do I have my, oh, here we go. I have a question, if you don't mind me asking. The first one, I am a Jewish woman who lost half my family to the Holocaust, like many of us. And I'm also a teacher, and I teach 10-year-olds. And I speak to them, I teach them all about the Holocaust. And many times they're shocked, and of course they're young, but their families don't know, and they teach them. Anyway, I feel it's very important to pass the story, to pass history around. So my question is, I'm wondering what they do teach you, because Nora, you said it sounded a little vague. I'm wondering in your high schools, in your middle schools, what type of history they do teach you about the Holocaust. What do they actually tell you?
I mean, maybe I'll just speak about my experience, because I think it really depended on which state you went to school in and grew up, and who your particular teacher was. And so in my case, we learned, all the historic facts. We analyzed Adolf Hitler's speeches word by word. We went to concentration camp museums. We talked to survivors. It was very, very intensive, and rightfully so. But as I mentioned earlier, in my experience, the personal component was missing, so we weren't encouraged to go back into our families and continue with the research. And so we never, what happened, I think, is that a paralyzing sense of guilt set in, and I think that's never helpful. I think what would have been more helpful would be to teach us how to then constructively apply that knowledge of history to the present time and replace the word guilt with responsibility. But I don't know.
And so it never goes down to an individual level, in my experience. So I lived in Israel for some time, and my friends from Israel told me it's the most normal thing when you're in 5th grade that you create a family tree, and about in reference to where your family was and who survived and who died in the Shoah. In Germany, it's like impossible to think that that's going to happen. It just doesn't happen. I mean, the only thing I know about my grandfathers is that they served in the Wehrmacht. But no, many people just fell silent, and then you are not encouraged to investigate in your own family. So, and an even more crass example is that my great-grandfather died in a gas chamber, and I only found out when I was 28. So it's just something in many families you just don't deal with. So when I heard earlier that Germans are praised for how allegedly we are dealing with our past, I heard that for the first time. So it surprised me.
Yeah, but actually it's true. I'm allowed to tell that because I'm Jewish and I'm foreigner, and I've never went to German school, but I was really, really deeply surprised and moved how Germans were dealing with their past. And it's a bit neurotic because, you know, my husband, German husband, I don't have Italian one, but anyway, he's almost 50, and he told me that they learned about Holocaust in 6 different subject courses, yeah. And actually, they knew so many things about Holocaust, but they didn't learn that Israel exists. They didn't learn that some Jews survived. So he was a bit shocked to meet me. No, I didn't want to make it funny, but actually I was deeply moved in the beginning of 90s, coming from Soviet Union, which is also part of this guilt of the whole story in 20th century, and it's not that easy to be Russian speaker. So that's actually, this part is completely forgotten in Germany. So I'm also part of this imperial guilt or whatever, you know. So being Jewish, yeah. Actually it was a very interesting thing. I am coming from Kiev, 100,000 people killed in my city, in the middle of the city. There was no single line in my textbook. Of course, I was completely moved in Germany. Then everybody knew, you know, not about my city, but anyway. And in Soviet Union at this time, in the beginning of 90s, there was a possibility of accepting of this imperial Soviet, whatever guilt, responsibility for pact, which is actually cost all that, you know, because it was a silent agreement about all of that. So it's very, very important issue. So, of course, Germans themselves could not say we did something, but we people from outside can tell that it's really very important. And I agree with you, it was in your childhood more in institutional level, because even institutions accepted that. But in the 60s, it was, of course, personal. And I think that nowadays we are again moving to this personal level. And actually, I also had few encounters. And for me, writing this book or being in Germany or whatever, just to be a person is very, very important that as a Jewish, as a part of this narrative, I'm absolutely not better than other people, you know. So, and it's very, very important because it's how common racism is starting. I don't have any rights to be better person just because I have my victims there. And concerning teaching, I'm not sure. I am pretty sure that teaching kids about Holocaust, especially when they are German, one has to rethink when one has to start. Because I absolutely not agree with the concept of teaching kids when they're 10 years old and they didn't read Schiller, Goethe, and just fairy tales. They are starting with Anna Frank. I think it's a damage for the soul. Soul has to be a little bit, I don't know, developed for all this. Otherwise, you break kids or you make them insensitive. So, and I don't know. And of course, in each class, you would even watching news or watching I don't know, cartoons. There are always kids who are okay and kids who are not okay. So it's a big question for teachers: what age and how. Because talking about violence, you sometimes are very violent.
Definitely, you teach it very carefully. You leave out certain.
I do hope. But, sorry,
no
but it's really interesting because I am turning to be aggressive talking about this kind of.
Any more questions?
So hi, I'm from the Goethe Institute San Francisco, and we were talking so much about history here and about the Holocaust. So I really would love to invite you to our exhibit, Lest We Forget. The exhibit is on the Civic Center Plaza in San Francisco and shows portraits of Holocaust survivors, and it's a really powerful and moving exhibit done by a German-Italian photographer named Luigi Toscano, typical German name. And it's on display at Civic Center Plaza until the 19th of May, so you have a good chance. It's outside, so you can go there day and night. And next week on the 13th, we have a panel in the Goethe Institute about anti-Semitism, past and present. And we have a film series in the public library. You find that on our website, goethe.de/events. So just sorry of taking your time, but I thought we were talking so much about that theme. Maybe you want to get some deeper into it. Thank you.
Permanent, permanent. I saw it in Kiev.
I think this is first to Takis, but to all of you. When the most interesting thing today was when you said, when we all went, in response to your reading about the child, and you said, that's not how people react in Germany. And I just came from the climate change talk about how uninhabitable things are likely to become, and Germany at a distance has been both frustrating because you still have a coal problem, but also incredibly inspiring because the country seems to be taking this on in a much more direct, progressive way. I have felt like Angela Merkel was the leader of the free world, especially since Trump got elected, and it's been great. I'm wondering that the climate change guy, when he was asked what are the most important things we can do now, said, well, one of the most important is to develop empathy, And I'm wondering two things. One, do you feel there's still an empathy gap? Is that part of what you were sensing, is that empathy comes more easily to certain cultures than others? Or were you referring to something else in terms of our response versus what you get? And secondly, in that we will all have an excruciating job dealing with our own current complicity in climate change in future times. So we drive, in this town, we drive gas-sipping cars. We do our best, but we still drive, we still fly. We are complicit. Do you see a connection that you all have created as a culture because you've done so much work in confronting an earlier complicity? I think to a degree you just answered this by saying it hasn't really become a source of interpersonal strength. But I'm not sure you fully answered it.
To answer your first question first, because I didn't really understand the second one. I'm not a sociologist, and I've only just moved to New York a month ago. So probably Nora would be the better person to ask what the difference between German and American society are. But if I'm just guessing, I'd say it doesn't have anything to do with more or less empathy. I think it has more to do with that, at least in my experience, it's easier for most Americans to express publicly what they feel. So, I was, like, we all stay in this hotel, and when I came down, there was this woman waiting at the elevator, and I came down from the room with my friend, and I saw, when we walked up to the elevator, I saw this woman looking at us, and that she wanted to connect, to come back to the subject of this panel, and I was almost, I hope she's not in here, I was almost embarrassed by the feeling that she wants to do that. And then she said something about the dress of my friend. You have a beautiful dress, a compliment like that. And that's something that happens in Germany once in 20 years.
It was me.
I wouldn't agree.
Yeah, I've heard.
Maybe to your
or to give you a more precise example, because it's you can count that in statistics. It's in Germany. I hear once a year, "You're very tall." Here, people ask me 3 times every day, how tall are you? And people say random stuff like also in an elevator in Washington, D.C., you could block my shot. And so I think it has a lot to do with that. And your second question is, so, and also, I mean, and I understand that and I have to say, and now I'm going to say something that will probably make you not buy my book because you think I'm an idiot, but I think it's absurd when you look at the United States and what's happening here with the view on climate change is ridiculous. Because I mean, I've never heard one German politician said that, Beatrix von Storch, which is a flat-out idiot, but you just don't hear the position that climate change doesn't exist. It's something I can't believe that people actually still say that, and that the size of the cars and you know, it's just something that's very, very difficult to get. But I think on the other side, being sensitive about the subject is not anything particularly German. And I think, so if you look at Berkeley, for example, I've seen more hybrid cars here than anywhere else in the world. So I think what we are facing is not a situation where the culture differs between countries, but between groups within countries. I think I'm probably a lot closer to you here than I'm to people living in some remote Trump place in Kansas or some remote German village in the Erzgebirge. I think so. I think the leaders of the independent world and values that we probably would all agree on, for some reason now are not united through nationhood, but through actually just the common belief in values, which maybe is a good thing.
I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I want to thank you, because I know that there's not that much interest in America for translated books. I'm very happy that you came, and maybe you are interested now, maybe you want to buy the books, you can find them outside. Our writers will be there and sign their books. And I have to thank the program sponsors, Wunderbar Together, initiated by the German Federal Foreign Office and the Goethe Institute. They made this event possible. We were supported by the Federation of German Industries, the Goethe Institute San Francisco. You met Sigrid Savelsberg. She's the director of the Goethe Institute in San Francisco. Goethe Institute's translation support program Books First, and we are also supported by the Consulate General of Switzerland in San Francisco and Pro Helvetia. And I was asked to tell you about an event that didn't make it onto the schedule. At 7 p.m. at the Freight and Salvage, the festival will screen a new documentary on famed journalist Robert Scheer. Wristbands are valid for this program, or priority tickets are only $10 as usual. So thank you very much, and enjoy the...